Seeing how over the course of the form that we were test driving, the path to data can be changed along the way, but it doesn't need to be continually redefined. So at stage 0, I might say path to data equals quote and never change it, and I don't need to continually set that value. It will be sticky for the life of the user's interaction with the form. Until I change it, it will remain that path to data being quote. Language is an optional field, but this is a field that is used whether or not as an attribute. You'll recall that in the initial invocation, the initial call to the decision service from the front end specifies language just as a representation of the options available, to where you might pass in optional parameters up front on the initial stage of a form, which might influence how that form will render from the get-go. Label position, somewhat self-explanatory, just the position of the labels that we will be defining overall in all of the a given stage of the UI. UI.done is just a Boolean that will be set once the form is complete. This will essentially just tell the front end to stop rendering the next button, and instead you may recall at the end of the form when we saw that all done string of text. Now, no UI to render continue is a very literally named Boolean, as it suggests. What we're doing when we assign no UI to render continue to be true in any given stage is basically to execute some sort of decision unrelated to presenting an actual prompt or anything at all to the end user at that particular stage. So if I set at stage 5 no UI to render continue to be true, then there will never be a point at which we're stopping on stage 5 and presenting something to the user. We will be doing something within the rules likely, but we'll be skipping over that in terms of what the end user is seeing and merely going on to the subsequent stage number that's defined within that stage 5 rule sheet. Now, continuing on to that stage on exit, that's a concept that's a bit more advanced, and we'll get into that later on, but let's continue into the association, which is the container associated within this UI entity. Again, the structure is always going to have UI at the root, then containers. Containers, as a reminder, is that black box that we were seeing in that test driver screen. When I open up the container, I'll see the attributes that are available to me. The main ones here really are just going to be ID and title. Those are the only required attributes involved in the container. And the title is the one which will actually render as the header within the container presented to the end user. That top bolded bigger font for the title of that particular stage presented to the end user. Whereas everything in UI doesn't influence necessarily what the actual content presented to the user is. It's mostly a defining metadata involved in the form and keeping track of various different temporary variables. Container is where we start to actually define the content that will be evaluated with the rules. Underneath container, you'll recall that UI control comes next. And UI control is where we were talking about the degree to which this is a very expandable and a very interoperable solution, where we might change the names or the conventions that we're using here to match existing systems or existing runtimes that better suit the just the vernacular we're using. UI control is the terminology we use, and UI control.type refers to the type of input that we are creating and rendering for the user at a given stage. Now, this is where custom data types also come back in. You'll recall that the coverage level custom data type is being used for the drop down and within the rule execution of, especially within the context of that branch object in the rule flow. But similarly, the UI control type custom data type has the list of various different UI controls which are basically useful to serve the purpose of allowing me, the rule modeler, to know what UI control types I might want to create that are already configured and ready to be rendered by the front end. So if I create a UI control of a type yes, no, then that's all I need in order for the front end to understand that it must create a drop down with two options, yes and no. Now let's review quickly what each of these are doing. A few of these are mostly to open up your imagination, but the first bunch of them are all fully supported and already implemented in the test template for the test driver of the dynamic form. Text is just a single line text field, like what we were seeing for the where we entered the name of a given town in that initial stage of the form. Single choice is going to render, one other thing on the text input that will, as you might assume, it will store the data. It will be parsed out. Whatever the user enters in a UI control type of text will then be available to be stored underneath the accrued values as a string data type. So I might say that the UI control type of text is being used with a field name of quote.city, and I would basically parse out the value selected for that particular UI control, parse it out, and put it into the quote.city fields within my vocabulary attributes, because it's a string data type, and I can then thereafter use that data field and reference it in the rules later on. Single choice is going to render a UI control that just looks like a checkbox. If the user checks it, then the value assigned to the given field name will be true. If it's not checked, it will be false. Multiple choices is that drop down of any number of options. Multiple choices are, there's a few more concepts that you'll need to understand, particularly with respect to how we render the options in the drop down of multiple choice UI controls. So we'll get into that in the actual rules themselves. Date time, pretty self-explanatory. That will render a date time input, which will then store as a date time data type. We can likewise use that to solicit from the end user just a date, and we can use a Boolean attribute underneath the UI control for that's essentially, we'll say show time, which is going to, if set to false, it will not render the time aspect of that UI control. We'll get into that as well when we expand out the UI control, various different configurations available. Read-only text, number here is similar to just the text, but it will use the HTML client-side validations for when we enter any sort of text that is not an integer. We'll get that error flag, an error warning, and ultimately we can use that as it is stored as a integer data type or a decimal data type. Read-only text, self-explanatory. This is where we're going to merely, where we're not assigning any sort of field name, because we're not looking for the end user to input anything. We're merely writing a string of text and presenting it to them. Yes, no Boolean will render a drop-down of yes or no, except yes will not be stored as the string yes. It will be stored as true or false in the case when they select no. And that's useful to have on hand for cases when we're assigning the field name of that yes, no Boolean UI control to be a vocabulary attribute that is Boolean itself. We don't want to be slotting in into a Boolean attribute the string of text yes or no, because that's not what Boolean implies. It wouldn't be storing as true or false, which Corticon would be expecting for a Boolean data type. Text area is going to provide a larger text box for the user to enter in text, but otherwise similar to the text UI control. File upload, another fairly straightforward to understand. Render a button to browse your file system and upload a file with a optionally defined path to where we're going to store that file. Multi-expenses is an example of a UI control where we're allowing the user to put in a variable number of inputs. In this case, it'll be You think of expenses as just line items of an invoice. So if you have 5 different expenses that you want to be reimbursed for, you might click that little plus sign to add 5 different options, write in the string of text and the value of a given expense. So that's a unique one that's pretty useful to build upon as well for cases where we have a one to any number of a one to n relation between the prompt and the number of responses that might be allowed. File upload expenses is just adding on to that previous UI control, which might require a document to be uploaded as proof for a given expense. Multiple choices multi-select is like that multiple choices UI control type, except in this case we're allowed to select more than one. And these bottom 3 are just representative of a few of the things that you might consider implementing as UI controls. All of the rendering code essentially will be read by JavaScript files that are within that CSC folder that we downloaded from GitHub at the start of this video, which means that the supported out-of-the-box UI controls, again, can be read and interpreted by the rendering template that we provide without any additional coding necessary to render all of these various different UI control types. But they can be adapted using that JavaScript, the source code that we provide. So you might want to look at the file upload or the yes/no Boolean UI control types, which are each coded in their own respective JavaScript functions to render them. And we can use that as the basis to then develop and expand upon the available types of UI controls that we might want at our disposal when we're building these forms and ultimately presenting the prompts to the end user.